Abstaining. And you all didn't hear that, so that's all okay. Anyway, welcome in all warm and cold ways, in the best of both worlds, to the audience here live at Marpet Commons at CMU, as well as those who are joining us via web and live streaming. And this evening, my name is Cheryl Pauls, and it is my honor to welcome you to this event. And it is an honor also to serve as president of CMU. And one of the reasons that is an honor and a joy to serve here is because of the quality of people who come together for conversation from all kinds of different starting places, and particularly those starting places of what teacher and student have to learn from one another, what people who converse across different disciplines as their first areas of inquiry and expertise have to contribute to the questions and the good qualities of living that we hope and pray for together. This series and this whole week of Scientists in Residence is something that has been made possible through the vision and the generous support of Dr. Richard Penner. I'd like Richard to stand up now so that we can thank you for your vision and support for this series. Thanks to Richard, and thanks also to all of the students and faculty at CMU who really tweaked not only Richard's interest, but his hope in terms of how matters of science and faith and many other areas of study can come together. Now I'd like to call on Dr. John Brubaker, Assistant Professor of Biology, to welcome our speaker this evening.
And I'll extend my welcomes and good evenings and all of that to you here and out there in the wide beyond as well. Welcome to CMU's third annual Scientist in Residence public lecture. That's just me I'm looking at. Okay. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce to you this year's Scientist in Residence, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. Dr. Hayhoe grew up mostly in southern Ontario with a few years in Colombia, where her parents worked as missionaries. She earned a bachelor's degree in physics from the University of Toronto, and her master's and doctoral degrees in atmospheric physics at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, a place that is also dear to my heart. She is currently an associate professor at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas, where she wears a number of hats. She serves as director of the Climate Science Center there, and her research interests are in the development of climate projection models to predict the impacts of climate change on humanity and the ecological systems that we are a part of. Her home department, interestingly, is the Department of Political Science, and I think you'll hear tonight how the social sciences also shape the way she thinks about the challenges presented by climate change and the solutions that give her hope. Dr. Hayhoe is also the founder and CEO of Atmos Research, a consulting firm that helps an array of clients with collecting, analyzing, interpreting, and presenting climate-related information. Above all, Dr. Hayhoe is a communicator. It has been wonderful to be able to hear from her and interact with her here at CMU this week. I think it's fair to say, with a fair amount of understatement, that the past year has drawn many of the divisions in North American society to our attention in ways that have been disheartening. We're all sadly skilled at putting labels on various groups and then identifying with or against those groups. Muslim versus Christian versus atheist, urban versus rural, left versus right, the 1% versus the 99%, coasts versus heartland, and on and on. And even more disturbingly, the louder voices in the room too often make use of the leap from those labels to broader categories like smart and stupid, or good and evil. And all of that makes constructive dialogue awfully hard. Against that backdrop, Dr. Hayhoe presents a welcome alternative. I described her to one of my classes earlier this week as a patient explainer. But what I've come to realize in the past few days is that she is, first of all, a skilled listener who literally and figuratively meets people where they are at. What strikes me about her is that she simply does not fit into any particular box. And as a result, people who might not normally trust a scientist trust her. People who might not normally listen to an evangelical Christian listen to her. Perhaps as a result, she serves on what I can only describe as a few zillion scientific advisory councils and panels. And I should also say, I suppose, that a quick glimpse at her Twitter account will show you that not everybody trusts her. But despite some very venomous backlash, she speaks with grace and, most importantly, hope. Anthony Lazarowitz, the director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, has described her as a national treasure. In 2014, Time magazine named her one of the world's 100 most influential people, and Foreign Policy magazine one of 100 leading global thinkers. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Maclean's, Bill Moyers and Company, CBC Radio's Tapestry, and various documentary series, including her own ongoing PBS show, Global Weirding. Last year, she won the Friend of the Planet Award. You might wonder who gives out a Friend of the Planet Award, from the National Center for Science Education. With her husband, the linguist and pastor Andrew Farley, she has written A Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions. And now she's here to talk to us, and we will have time for questions afterwards. So, welcome, Katharine, and welcome, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction. That was, and I'm not kidding, the most thorough and the best introduction I've ever heard. I feel almost like, okay, now what more can I say? But I'm excited to be with you here tonight, thanks to the miracle of the internet. And I just want to check to make sure, can everybody see me and hear me okay? Okay, good. I was a little bit worried because all of you on the left put up your hands first. I was thinking, oh, what's wrong on the right? That's always both the curse and the blessing of reaching across space like this. We want to make sure it works, but I love the fact that I'm sitting here without having to get on an airplane, although honestly, I am missing Tim Hortons, so coming to Winnipeg would not have been a hardship. To be able to speak to you tonight about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So as every scientist does, I always have slides. It's a lot easier to look at pictures, I think, than just to listen to somebody. So I'm just going to share my slides with you. And here we go. If you don't mind giving me one more show of hands, can you see these slides? Yes, I see the hands go up. Good. So one of the things that often happens is as soon as somebody finds out that you study climate change, as I was giving a colleague's class the first year that I moved here to Texas Tech, you know, for a Canadian, moving to the States is a different country, but then moving to Texas is actually a whole different country. And so in my first semester here at Texas Tech, I was teaching a geology class for a colleague. And so I was taught all about the carbon cycle and the role of carbon in the Earth's history. And at the end of the class, one student in a class of about 300 stuck up his hand. And I thought, oh, a question, because every teacher loves a question. So I said, yes. And he said, are you a Democrat? That was how I learned, moving to Texas, that climate change is one of the most politicized issues in the United States. It isn't quite as politicized in Canada, but it's moving in that direction. Richard says that he can't see the presentation. Is that correct? Hang on a second here. Let's try to share the screen again. Okay. That's actually, thank you. That's very helpful. He's pointing the camera at the screen so I can see it, and you still can't see the screen. Let's try this one more time. Here we go, sharing the screen. And I'm not seeing it. Let's see, maybe if I share my whole screen with you, that might work. Maybe if I share the desktop. There. Any luck? Oh, looks like you can see something, right? All right, let's try this. Okay. No, it looks like you're still looking at something on the screen. I'm sorry. This is one of those things where it totally works when you practice it ahead of time. And then it works again when you practice it for the second time. And then when you get to the third time, which is the time that you're live, it's like, oh, it's not working anymore. So let's try this one more time here. I'll turn that off so you can see me. And then I will turn this back on, share screen. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm definitely sharing my screen here, so I think it must be something maybe in a different window at your end. I can just keep talking if you want me to. And while you guys try to figure it out, that's totally fine with me. Just let me know if there's anything that you need me to do. Because it does say, my screen does say that it is sharing, and it should be sharing. Okay. So, as a climate scientist, when I moved to Texas, I got my first invitation to speak to a group about climate change. It was a women's group at a local book club, actually. And being a typical scientist, I started with the science, and then I continued with more science, and then I kept on going with some more science, and I ended with science. And from all the questions I got afterwards, I realized that that really wasn't what people were wondering about. Because although climate change is a lot about the science, what people are really wondering is, if it's really real, what are we going to do about it? And doesn't the science somehow conflict with my faith? Because those scientists are telling me all kinds of other things that I don't necessarily believe. So do I have to agree with everything about the science to agree that climate is changing and we need to do something about it? So I listened to all their questions and I kind of took note of them. And I went back, and then the next week I got an invitation to speak at Second Baptist, not First Baptist, Second. Second tries things out, and then if it works, then First adopts it. So I went to Second Baptist with a little bit more, not just starting with the science, but starting with why I actually cared about it. Because I care about it specifically because I am a Christian. I did spend time in a developing country growing up, and I know how vulnerable people can be to a changing climate. I know firsthand that when you live in, a little house made of bamboo and cardboard boxes from old Tide detergent, that when the rains come, they can sweep away your entire house. And I know that as climate changes, that as the world warms, our evaporation rates are speeding up. And so we're actually getting more water vapor sitting up there in the atmosphere. So when a storm comes along, it picks up more water and it dumps on us. There's more people at risk from heavy rainfall and flooding today than there would have been 30 or 50 years ago. There's more people at risk from water contamination from all that heavy downpours. And knowing that that's what's happening, oh, yes? Knowing that that's what's happening, when I was studying astrophysics, and I sort of accidentally, one of those things that you think is accidentally, but you realize later is probably not an accident at all, I ended up taking a class in my last year at U of T that was about climate science. And I thought I was just going to do a career in astrophysics because that's what I really loved. But I took this climate science class, and it completely shocked me. Because I didn't realize, first of all, that climate science is all physics. In fact, some of it is even astrophysics, planetary atmospheres. But then the other thing I didn't realize was that it's such a big problem. We are not going to be able to fix problems like global poverty or the spread of diseases carried by mosquitoes or issues like water contamination that kill about 5 million people, most of them little children, every year. We can't fix these issues if we leave climate change out of the picture, because climate change is exacerbating what leads to these problems in the first place. And so I realized that trying to work on issues like world hunger and poverty and lack of access to clean water and people dying of diseases that nobody should die from in 2017, I realized that trying to fix these problems is like pouring all of our effort and our money and our prayers and our time and our commitment into this bucket. But this bucket has a hole in the bottom, and the hole is climate change. And so over time, that hole's getting bigger and bigger. And so we can't fix these problems if we don't patch that hole. So I'm going to admit to you, I always wanted to do something that helped people, but I have a very weak stomach. One time my friend was describing to me how she got that eye surgery done, where they like peel back your retina. I'm not going to go into any more detail in case anybody else has a weak stomach too. But I mean, I nearly passed out just listening to her description of the surgery. So I always thought it would be really awesome to be able to be a healthcare professional, a doctor, a nurse practitioner, a physio, something that actually helps people. And I never could. But when I took that class, I realized climate change affects people. That's why I care about it, because it affects the poor and the vulnerable more than anything. And so that's why I became a climate scientist. And that's why I decided I had to start talking about it too. Because even though we hear a lot about how people think climate change isn't really real in the States, the reality is that about 70% of people in the States do think climate change is real. They just don't think it matters. It's all about the polar bear, and it's not about people. And the reality is we care about climate change because we have 7.5 billion people here on this planet. And if climate changes, if sea level rises a meter, 2/3 of the world's biggest cities are within a meter of sea level. If the growing zones change, as they already have, and you can't grow the types of crops you're used to on your farm, or if it's too hot or too dry to grow anything at all, like it might be in Texas, you can't just pick up and move to Kansas or Nebraska or Manitoba or Saskatchewan and say, well, I want this land, because it's already taken. And moving up into the tundra won't do us much good either in most cases. With 7.5 billion people on the planet, we are extremely vulnerable to a changing climate. And that, again, is really why I care, because it disproportionately affects the poor and the vulnerable. But it really affects all of us, and it is already affecting us today, even though it may be in ways that we can't see yet. Let me stop here and just check. Are we able to, let me see if I share the screen. Are we able to see anything if I try to share the screen now? No? Doesn't look like it. Okay, let's see, stop share. Let's try one more time. And here we go. Let's try this one more time. Nope. Okay. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to kind of talk through what I wanted to talk to you about. But what I'm also going to do is something kind of fun. There's a cool way that you can actually tape yourself talking and your slides at the same time. And so I'm going to do that, and I'll put that on my website and on my Facebook page. So if anybody actually wants to see any of the pictures that I talk about, you can totally do that. And I can do that after this. But what I want to talk about first is I want to talk about what we know. Because if we're talking about climate change, there are things that we do know. So what do we know? What we know is that whenever we burn coal or gas or oil, it releases carbon dioxide into the air. We know that because we can measure it coming out of the tailpipes of our cars or the smokestacks of our factories. What else do we know? We know that we've been burning a lot more of this stuff year after year, ever since the Industrial Revolution. That was when we figured out how to burn massive amounts of coal and gas and oil to power our factories and our cars and our trains, and to improve our quality of life. So what else do we know? We know that burning coal and gas and oil has actually given us much better life today than we would have had 100 or 200 years ago. You know how there's all of these programs where you can, dress up like Jane Austen and go live in a Regency-style house, or where I'm from in Toronto, we have Black Creek Pioneer Village, and they have a camp in the summer where you can send your children to camp, and they dress them up in pioneer clothes and make them do chores all week. It's wonderful. I highly recommend it. But I am not one of those people who would like to go back to the old days, because honestly, I don't think I'd still be alive in those days. I think I probably would have died of some terrible disease. So burning coal and gas and oil has brought us tremendous benefits, but it came with a price. You know how they say there's no free lunch? There's no free lunch in this case because our planet has this amazing natural blanket around it. It is a natural blanket that keeps the Earth the perfect temperature for life. The sun's energy shines down and goes almost right through this blanket like a window because it's almost transparent to the sun's energy. The earth heats up and gives off heat energy, and that heat energy gets trapped by the blanket, just like a blanket keeps you warm on a cold night. But here's the thing, that blanket is made up of heat trapping gases, water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane. And when we burn coal and gas and oil, it produces a lot of carbon dioxide. When we mine coal, it produces methane. So we are, in effect, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet that it never needed. Imagine that you're asleep at night and your grandma, like my grandma always used to do, sneaks in the middle of the night and puts an extra blanket on you. And you wake up sweating. You say, Grandma, I didn't need that blanket. That's essentially what we are doing to our planet. And that is what we know. What else do we know? We know that our planet's climate has changed in the past, for sure. We know that it's changed because of natural cycles. We know that the sun's energy has gone up and down over time. We know that there are many natural reasons why climate has changed in the past. So that's why, as a climate scientist, one of the first things we do when we see something happening, when we see the planet is running a fever, we say, couldn't it just be a natural cycle? So we look at natural cycles and we say, could it be that we're just still warming after the last ice age? Well, it turns out we're not. The warming after the last ice age peaked several thousand years ago. And if you look at our temperature record, it was in a very, very, very gradual, long, slow slide into the next ice age. Now, not tomorrow and not the next day, not next year, maybe a few hundred years, maybe a few thousand years. But the next thing on our agenda was another ice age. Except then we hit the Industrial Revolution and all of a sudden our temperature went like this. Now, here's the interesting thing. Is another ice age good for us 7.5 billion people? Well, if you live down in the tropics, maybe you wouldn't care that much. But for us in Canada, most of Canada was covered in an ice sheet during the last ice age. So we don't want another ice age. So actually, a little extra bit of a blanket would have been really perfect. But we've gone a little bit too far. You needed, the lightest weight summer duvet that you can get at IKEA, and instead we got like this massive triple weight duvet that is trapping way too much heat. That's how we know that it isn't a natural cycle, because we should actually be cooling now, not warming. What else do we know? Here's a crazy thing. How long do you think we've known that burning coal and gas and oil produces carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide is wrapping an extra blanket around our planet, causing it to heat up? I want you to kind of fix a date in your head. How long do you think scientists have known that? They have known that since the 1850s. Isn't that crazy? A British scientist called John Tyndall did these are the first elaborate experiments to actually figure this stuff out. And there was actually an American woman called Eunice Foote who did not have a lot of expensive lab equipment, but she did some very rudimentary experiments and figured the same thing out. And this is the cool thing. She presented her results in, I think it was 1856, at the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting. And in 3 weeks, I'm going to the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting too. Over 100 and how many years later is that? 160 years later. That's how long we've known that this thing is real. Isn't that crazy? So when you hear people saying, well, we just don't know enough yet, we don't really know if it's us, we're not sure if it's really happening, those were valid things to say back in the 1800s. But now we've had so long to study this thing, we really are sure that it's real. And what's one more thing that we know? And this is an interesting thing. Last year, my program director, a very nice man who completely supports what I do, he came to me and he said, Katharine, if you could just tell your colleagues not to be, quite so alarmist about it. If they just kind of toned it down a bit, because they're always crying wolf and it just comes off poorly. And what was so interesting was just before he said that to me, a new paper had just been published that looked at that exact question. They said, is it true that scientists are biased on the side of being too alarming with their information? So what these people did is they added up 20 years of studies. So from 1990 to 2010, they added up hundreds of studies to see if they had predicted over that 20 years, if they had predicted more or less change. Not just looking at global temperature, looking at impacts on sea level rise, on changes in how far north animals are moving, how fast glaciers are melting. And when I heard what they were doing, I thought, this is my guess, I thought they're going to find that there isn't a bias because we scientists try so hard to be unbiased. But that's not what they found. They found that we are biased. We are biased in the direction of systematically underweighting the risks. Is that crazy or what? So they looked at 20 years worth of papers saying what would happen, and then they looked at 20 years worth of data saying what really happened, and they compared it, and there was a systematic underestimation. And so they actually said, rather than being, drama queens, scientists are maybe more like anti-drama kings, that we are actually conservative because we're so scared of being called an alarmist. Because that's like one of the worst things you can call a scientist. So that's actually kind of scary when you think about it. The scientists are systematically underestimating the risks of climate change. What type of risks are those? Well, there's a great show that was on TV this past year, so you can find it online on Amazon Video or Netflix or things like that. There's this great show called The Years of Living Dangerously. And a number of the episodes are actually on YouTube for free, including the first one that I was in. So The Years of Living Dangerously, great title. What it does is it goes around the world talking to real people who are being affected by a changing climate today. It asks the question, what are the risks that people face from a changing climate today? Here's just a few of those risks. And if you're interested in finding out more, watch The Years of Living Dangerously. It was really an awesome show. One of the biggest risks is extreme heat. Now, on the plus side, as it gets warmer, there is often less extreme cold. And though, I don't know if you've noticed, but as the poles are warming faster, like the Arctic is warming faster than the mid-latitudes, because all of that shiny white ice and snow is melting. And so when the sun's energy shines down on the dark ocean, it absorbs more of the sun's energy. So the Arctic is warming faster than the mid-latitudes, and that means that the jet stream is kind of going crazy. It's starting to do this big wiggle thing in the winter that brings down these crazy cold air masses, not just as far as Winnipeg, brings them all the way down to Toronto and even all the way down to Texas. So ironically, these crazy outbreaks of cold weather we've been having in the winters lately that people have been complaining about so much, they're happening because the Arctic is warming so much faster than the rest of the world that the jet stream is starting to wiggle and meander like this during the winter instead of just whipping around the world like it should be doing. And that's bringing down the cold Arctic air. So we're still getting cold. We're still getting crazy cold, but we're also getting crazy heat. Back in 2003, they had a record-breaking heat wave in Europe. Some of you maybe remember that. Scientists were able to calculate that the risk of that heat wave had doubled because of climate change. In other words, picture two dice. And they have 2 6s on them, right? So you always have a chance of rolling the double 6. That's a natural heat wave. But what climate change is doing when we're not looking is it's sneaking in and it's replacing another one of those numbers with a 6. So now our chances of rolling that double 6 are greater than they would have been 50 or 100 years ago. That heat wave in Europe, when all was said and done, when they added up all the numbers, do you know how many people died prematurely during that heat wave? Get a number in your head. And then honestly tell me, was it as high as the real number? Because the real number was 70,000 people. 70,000. Isn't that crazy? So heat is one of the most obvious ways that we're affected by a changing climate because our heat waves are getting more extreme, but there's a lot more to it than that. I talked earlier about how in a warmer world, water evaporates quicker. So the average humidity in the atmosphere is increasing, which means when a storm comes along, it picks up all that water vapor and it dumps it on us. And our heavy downpours are increasing significantly all around the mid-latitudes. We're also seeing stronger hurricanes, not more frequent hurricanes, but we're seeing stronger ones. Why? Because hurricanes get their energy from warm ocean water. And you know what? Remember that all the extra heat that blanket is trapping that we're wrapping around the earth? Over 90% of that extra heat is going into the ocean, not even the atmosphere. So as the ocean warms, it has so much more energy to give hurricanes, and hurricanes are getting stronger. And they're not just devastating people in the United States and up the coast of Canada, they're devastating many, many very poor countries like the Philippines and South Pacific Islands. Again, hurricanes are a normal part of life, but picture those two dice again. They're sneaking in and changing some of those other numbers to sixes. So now we have a greater risk of severe hurricanes than ever before. And in fact, the other year, they had the first Category 6 hurricane ever recorded. They're getting stronger because the ocean is essentially feeding them steroids. So why do we care about a changing climate? We care about it because it exacerbates the risks that we already face today. And those risks fall disproportionately on people who are poor and vulnerable and lack the ability to prepare. So, what do we think about climate change? Well, if you ask people, are you concerned about climate change? The numbers kind of go up and down. And I have these super cool maps actually of Canada. You can look them up by Googling Yale Public Opinion Climate in Canada. I have these super cool maps of Canada that ask people, do you think that the Earth is getting warmer? And it breaks out the results actually by riding. So you can see individual ridings. So in the riding of Winnipeg in Manitoba, just over, about 55 to 60% of people would say, sure, it's getting warmer. And if you look across a lot of the other provinces, except for Alberta, the numbers are quite a bit higher. But across all of Canada, it's over 50% of people would say, yeah, it's getting warmer. And I don't know about you, but being from Toronto, it is definitely getting warmer. My birthday's in April, and tulips are my favorite flower. And so I was always waiting by the garden to see if the tulips would come out in time for my birthday. And sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. Nowadays, when I go back to Toronto for a visit, I say, where are the tulips? And my mother says, well, they bloomed in March and they're gone now. We've even had entirely snowless winters in Toronto, which was actually kind of a blessing in disguise since my grandparents had just moved into a senior's home without covered parking. So they were really worried about, not being able to clear the snow off their cars. So they had 2 snowless winters where they didn't have to do that. So yes, there are some good things to warming occasionally, yes. But overall though, especially for people who don't have the resources to adapt, overall, the greater impacts are definitely getting worse and worse over time. So most people across Canada think it's warming, but then do you think it's happening mostly because of human activities? Just about all of Canada, except a tiny little area around Montreal, literally just a little area around Montreal, is the only one where more than 50% of people say yes. So you might say, okay, well then what should we do about that? Shouldn't we be just, giving people the facts? And honestly, probably about once a week, I get somebody calling me up or sending me an email and saying, hey, Katharine, would you just go talk to so-and-so? Because if they just knew the facts, I am sure they would change their minds. Here's the thing. The facts will often not change our minds. Why is that? Because the social science studies have shown that our opinions about issues like climate change, they're so politicized and so polarized, often have very little to do with the science, but they have everything to do with basically our tribe, who we're part of, what community we're part of, and what that community thinks. It's so prevalent that I even have a little video. I have that Global Weirding series. You can find it on my Facebook page, or you can find it on globalweirdingseries.com. It'll take you straight to the YouTube page. I even have one little Global Weirding video on the facts are not enough. But I also have a video on, well, how can we talk about this thing? And if our opinions about, is climate change real? Should we be doing anything to fix it? If our opinions have that much to do with our community that we live in, then it is so important to actually think, well, what type of communities do we live in? We live in communities that are geographic, of course. We all live in the same neighborhood, the same town, the same province. But we also very much live in communities like our university or our church. If you look around the entire world, about 51% of people in the world are Protestant, and about 24% are Catholic. So over 75% of people around the entire world are Christian. We read the Bible. What does the Bible say about climate change? Well, I'll give you a clue. If you did like a Google word search or something, you wouldn't find climate change anywhere in the Bible. No. But if we go through the Bible, we do find many, many verses relating to caring for the planet, responsibility for what God has given us. In Genesis 1, it talks about how God created humans to have responsibility over every living thing on this planet. And so from that, we get the idea of stewardship or caring for this responsibility that we've been given. Imagine if you inherited a farm, and maybe some of you did, if you inherit a farm from your parents or your grandparents, people who you respect and you love, who lovingly tended and cared for that farm and made sure that every person and everything on that farm was healthy, from the livestock to the soil to the family. Imagine if you inherit that farm and then you decide that you're just going to pull every last penny that you can out of that farm. You're just going to take it for all you can get and leave it to absolute rack and ruin when you're done. What would you think of somebody who did that? We think, well, what a way to carry on the legacy of their family. What disrespect for their parents and their grandparents who gave them that farm. What a lack of responsibility for the soil, for the crops, for the livestock, and for their own family. To just take every penny they could for short-term gain and then leave the farm essentially in rack and ruin. We know that that is not the way to honor the responsibility and the gifts that we've been given. So in the same way, take that same picture and apply it to the planet. As Christians, we believe that God created this amazing world that we live in and gave it to us. One of the biggest questions I get is, well, doesn't the idea that humans could affect something as big as the planet challenge the idea of God's sovereignty? I'd say, well, it would if God said that he were in charge of the planet. But in Genesis 1, it actually says we are in charge of the planet. So there's many verses that go on to say that if you have been given a responsibility, that you should fulfill that trust or that responsibility that you've been given. So we've been given this incredible planet, and depending on how you look at Genesis 1, some people, you can use the King James Version that says we've been given dominion. So in other words, people say, oh, well, we are rulers over this planet. So, and I'm literally quoting people here. So because we are rulers over this planet, we can extract every last bit of fossil fuels and other resources that we have, just extract it all, burn it all. And when it's all over, well, the world's going to end anyways. This is an argument that sadly I often hear from people who would say that we believe the Bible. But when we really look to the Bible, we see these core messages of responsibility and of love. Because that really is the second part of it. It isn't just about viewing the world as separate from us, as if somehow we could survive just, floating in space without this planet. This planet is the only home that we have, and we depend on it intimately for every breath that we take, for every drop of water that we drink, for every piece of food that we eat, for safe places to live. Our planet is our home, and we cannot survive without it. And so that's why I think the second part is not just caring for the planet as if it were something other than ourselves, but recognizing that by providing a healthy home for ourselves, for our children, for our community, and for other people, for the poor farmer in Africa, for the seaside fisherman in the Philippines, we are helping our brothers and our sisters around the world to also have enough food to drink, clean air to breathe, fresh water, and a safe place to live. So as a scientist, again, as I told you, I often started with the science, and then I continued with the science, and then I ended with the science. But now I think it's most important to begin with our hearts. What is it that we truly and genuinely care about? What values, what loves, and what concerns do we share with whoever it is that we're talking to? For many of us, it may be our faith. For others, it might not. It may be that we're both hunters and we want to make sure that there's a healthy ecosystem there to support the species that we love to hunt. It might be that we are skiers and we want to make sure that we can pass that love on to our children. It might be that we care about the economy. And that's, I think, where it's so important to talk solutions. So the last thing I want to do is I want to talk solutions, because what I've found is that often when I talk with people and they say, oh, that thing isn't really real, or even if it is real, we shouldn't do anything about it because it's way too expensive. Often, even though it may appear that we disagree, we can find solutions that we do agree on, even if we're never going to agree on the politics, because frankly, if anybody ever does agree with everybody on politics, that's going to be a bigger miracle than I think any of us have ever seen. So what types of solutions are there when it comes to a changing climate? One of the first things to do is just simply acknowledge this is a real problem affecting real people today, whether they're devastated by floods in Bangladesh or by floods in Texas. The second thing we can do is prepare, because 9 times out of 10, the way that climate change is going to hit us is right in our Achilles heel, where we're already vulnerable today. What's the Achilles heel of Texas, where I live now? Water. There is never enough water, and farmers depend on the underground aquifer in dry years, but that aquifer is going one way fast. So switching from those big pivot irrigation systems, which many people still have here, to drip irrigation that uses much less water and much less is lost evaporation is a super smart way to prepare, because you save water and you know that you'll have enough in the future. How are they preparing in the Netherlands? The Netherlands, a large part of it is below sea level, and sea level is rising. Now, sea level is rising because ice sheets are melting, but it's also rising because warmer water takes up more space. And remember, over 90% of that extra heat is going into the ocean. So what are they doing in the Netherlands? They're building floating villages. So when sea level goes up a meter, what are they going to do? They'll get a meter more anchor chain. Not a big deal. And then we can look for different ways to get our energy. Here in Texas, it's actually really crazy. We're up to 20% energy from wind, and wind and solar energy in Texas, and as well as in some more southern states, is now cheaper than natural gas. Fort Hood is the biggest military base in the entire United States. It's in Texas, of course. And they just went with wind and solar energy for their new electricity contract because they'd save $168 million. Isn't that crazy? Now you might say, yes, but what about all of the people who live in energy poverty today? And it's true, there's 1 billion people around the planet, the very poorest of the poor, who don't have electricity. And because they don't have electricity, it's hard to keep your food from going bad. It's hard to get clean water. There's many hardships associated with energy poverty. It is real. So am I saying that we should just deprive those people of the cheap energy on which we built our developed countries? I'm not saying that at all, because you know what? They don't have coal and oil and gas, with the exception of maybe Venezuela and Nigeria and a handful of other countries. They don't have vast untapped resources of fossil fuels like we did. In fact, if you look at the statistics, 6% of the world's fossil fuels are in Africa, most of those in Nigeria. 3% are in the Asia Pacific area, and the rest of it are in North America, the Middle East, and Europe, a bit more in Latin America. Whereas I'll tell you what they do have a lot of. In Southeast Asia and in Africa, they have a lot of sun and they have a lot of wind. So I have this awesome picture I wish I could show you. It's like my favorite picture of a thatched roof hut in Africa with a solar panel on the roof. Because then you don't have to build the electricity grid anymore. You don't have to build a giant power plant and somehow be indebted for the rest of the life of that power plant for all of that gas or coal, which you can't grow yourself. Rather, you can grow your energy on your own roof. But most of all, I think our solutions have to be based on hope. not guilt, and on love, not fear. My favorite Bible verse is one that has nothing to do with climate change. It's from 2 Timothy, where it says that God has not given us a spirit of fear. So much of the rhetoric around climate change has fear in it, or maybe it has anger and then it has fear below that. It has fear that we've gone too far. It has fear that we're not taking action quickly enough. It has fear that it's going to ruin the economy if we do. It has fear that it's going to hurt me and my comfortable lifestyle if I take this issue seriously. Whenever I hear an argument, I have a litmus test, though. My litmus test is 2 Timothy 1:7. God is not given us the spirit of fear. What do we have? We have a spirit of power, getting stuff done, of love and care for others, and this is my favorite, a sound mind. To make good decisions that are smart decisions, that make sense, but they're made with a loving heart. So what are some things that each of us can do individually? My last global weirding video that just came out today is 6 short minutes on all the crazy little different things that we can do. And there's this other awesome website called climatecaretakers.org. It is an online Christian community that every month sends you ideas of what you personally can do. I know it sounds ridiculous, but little changes can have a big ripple impact. Changing one light bulb, you're like, one light bulb, putting in a new LED, that'll do nothing. Well, first of all, it'll save you about $30 over the lifetime of the bulb, or more if your electricity is even more expensive. But if we all did those little things, it really does add up. And it doesn't just change our actual carbon footprint. It actually changes us here, and it changes us here. Heart, here. Because if we feel like we're part of the solution, then we have hope and we can move forward. Whereas when we feel like it's never going to be fixed or I don't want to fix it, that's when we end up stuck in fear. So I'm going to end with 2 quotes, one from my favorite scientist and then one from the Bible. My favorite scientist is Jane Goodall. I don't know if you remember her. She's the one who lived with the chimpanzees. Back when I was little, my parents are both teachers, and they read a book that said that television is bad for children's brains. So we had no television, but every Friday night, my mom would go to the library and she would take out movies. And our favorite movies were watching Jane Goodall with her chimps. I was so fortunate. I actually got to meet Jane Goodall for the first time just last year. And around that time, she said something which I think just perfectly encapsulates what I was trying to communicate here. This is what she said. She said, "It is only when our clever brain and our human heart work together in harmony that each of us can achieve our full potential." And in the Bible, Apostle Paul puts it this way: the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Thank you. Oops.
Okay, so we have some time for questions. A couple of things to keep in mind here. The only way that Katharine can hear us from this end is if you are talking into a mic. So I believe we have a couple of mics set up. There's one here in the middle. Do we have another roaming? There's a couple roaming as well. So if you have a question, please just raise your hand. And Tim, you're walking up here with your phone in hand. We may have gotten some online texts as well. We have a text? Oh, we have a good text question. All right.
Oh, is that good? Okay.
Well, why don't we start with the good text question then?
We'll need to power that mic on. Thank you, David. Okay, great. Here's a text question from Mike. Can climate change be reversed, or should our time and energy be spent on adapting to what's coming?
Great question. That is a good question. The time when we had the luxury of choosing between just adapting or preparing for a different future versus reducing our emissions, that time is unfortunately come and gone. Why do I say that? I say that because, first of all, a certain amount of change is inevitable because of all of the emissions that have been built up over the past decades and even centuries. It's kind of like, picture this. Imagine if you, although you would never do this, imagine if somebody you know ate nothing but McDonald's and pizza every single day. I don't know if anybody ever saw that Super Size Me movie. I cannot eat McDonald's after I saw that movie. It was awful. He ate McDonald's for 6 months, and then his doctor told him he was going to die if he didn't stop. Anyways, imagine if you ate McDonald's and pizza every day, you never exercised, and you smoked. And then you got a huge wake-up call in terms of a near-death experience because of your poor health habits. And you immediately went cold turkey. You ate very healthy food, you started to exercise, you stopped smoking. Well, you're going to be in a lot better condition if you stop doing that, but there's still some accumulated damage. But on the other hand, if your doctor told you if you don't stop now, you only have, X amount of time left, well, there's certainly a benefit to stopping. So we have to prepare for a certain amount of change, but what I specifically study is I study what's going to happen in the future depending on the choices we make today. And I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that in just about every part of the world, there is a massive difference in terms of the impacts we're going to experience if we go our merry way versus the impacts we're going to experience if we make a concerted effort to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. I'm not talking about flipping some kind of magic switch today. That's just not practical. But I am talking about a concerted effort to make that shift faster than it would naturally occur, because the impacts under the business as usual, we can't adapt to. We can't adapt to without serious economic losses and very serious suffering. Whereas the impacts under the everything we can, as fast as we can scenario, there will still be impacts that are dangerous. There will still be impacts that are severe. There are already a few tribes of Native Americans who are official climate refugees up in Alaska and down in Louisiana. So there are still some very serious and dangerous impacts, but globally, will our society and our civilization and our economy be able to continue? The answer is yes, it would. And that is a choice that we have to make today. But again, every year that goes by without making choices is a year when you actually, pick this. Here's the cool thing, though, and I just want to say one more thing. You might say, okay, but what if we do everything we could do? But what about China and India? I mean, aren't they building a coal plant a day? Guess what? China is shutting down half-built coal plants. China cut its carbon emissions for 2 years in a row. China has more wind and solar energy than any other country in the entire world, and India is not far behind. So the good news is that the chances of this scenario are actually shifting. But they're just not shifting quite enough to get us all the way over here without action from all of us.
Other questions? I have a couple myself, so I can, I don't want to monopolize things. Katharine, you mentioned, when you were talking about facts not being enough tonight, you had also talked about kind of our own tribal identities or our deep set senses of self. And I think if I remember right from your Bill Moyers interview, you talked about climate change as a collective problem that requires collective solutions, and collective solutions mean government, I think was the way you put it. But we're increasingly disillusioned by our governments and skeptical of government. How do you bridge that gap, I guess?
Yes. Well, if you feel that way, imagine living in the States right now. It's a very interesting time to be alive. The reality is that climate change is what they call a tragedy of the commons. That's the term that was coined back in the 1960s, reflecting back on the common grazing area that English villages used to share. So everybody could graze their animals on this common grazing area, But if you grazed too many animals, then all the grass would be eaten up and there wouldn't be any grass left for anybody because it couldn't regrow. So the idea is that we all have to do our part in order to maintain just the right amount of grass for everybody. In the same way, we all need to do our part to maintain a healthy planet for all of us too. The reality is that we have to work together. And there's many different ways to work together. One of the ways, obviously, as you know, in British Columbia, that they've been doing it is through using a fee on carbon and then refunding that fee to people in their taxes. Now, that Yale climate opinion map, you know, where it has the opinions broken out by riding, that Yale climate opinion map last year asked people across all of Canada, do you support a carbon tax? And guess what? The only province where just about the entire province, I think there was just one riding, you know, way up in the north, but almost the entire province said, yes, they did support a carbon tax, was British Columbia, who have actually had one for 8 years. So that was really interesting. That's just one approach to do it. And I don't want to get into policy solutions because there's as many policy solutions as there are, you know, fingers on our hands. But the reality is that we need some solutions because our economy is extremely skewed in the direction of continuing our dependence on fossil fuels. Why is that? It's because they're heavily subsidized. They are subsidized to the tune of over $1 trillion a year, I think was the IMF's number, around the world. A lot of it's tax breaks, a lot of it's existing negotiations with governments that they have because they've been around so long. But the market is already skewed in terms of incentivizing us to stay with those. And it's a tough way to figure out, well, how can we skew that back to incentivize ourselves to make the right choices? One way they've done that in other places is with carrots for clean energy projects. Another way is simply efficiency. The cheapest way to reduce our emissions is just to use less energy, like we're doing right here. I didn't fly there. I'm talking to you from the university where we actually have a wind farm because we test wind turbines here at the university. So there's many different things that we can do, but the reality is we all do have to be doing them because it's our planet, all of our planets, and we can't fix it without each other.
Richard, please.
Katharine, how much of this problem is involving the speed of change? Because we know that, as you mentioned, change has been happening since the Big Bang, let's say. And we also are told that during the dinosaur days, which was definitely before the internal combustion engine was invented, the CO2 levels, we're told, were about 4 times what they are today. So the hunch is, like for us lay people, that must have been a slow enough change that life could adapt. Mm-hmm. Is that also a factor?
Yes, that is absolutely the factor. Right now, our climate is changing, our temperature is changing about 10 times faster than it's ever been known to change in the history of the Earth, and about 20 times faster than between the last ice age and today when there were humans around. And that speed of change doesn't just affect us. Obviously, it affects animals, plants, trees, wildlife, ecosystems. That rapid change is exactly the big problem. Now, our economy is also changing rapidly. And if we were back at like mid-century in terms of our carbon dioxide emissions, in terms of the thickness of that extra blanket we're wrapping around the Earth, if we were back, mid-century with the amount of climate change back then, but we had our economy that we have today, with China being the world leader in wind energy, with India installing massive solar farms, with Texas going green, who knew? If we were back in those days with our technology, I actually think we'd be okay. It's just that we have this mismatch where scientists have actually been warning us for years. It's been 51 years since US scientists formally warned the US government of the dangers of climate change. We have this mismatch of scale where if we had taken action earlier, if we had taken, the 70s oil crisis seriously and said, all right, we're just going to get rid of this stuff, we'd be in a totally different place today. It's just that we haven't moved fast enough, and the climate is moving too fast, and we need to get those back in sync.
Is there another text question?
Yes, here's a question from Joe Barnold, a CMU faculty member at Menno Simons. He asks, what are some careers or career skills that can help fight climate change?
Ooh, that's a great question. I do get that question a lot from students, especially saying, what should I study if I want to help in this area? And my answer is, you should study whatever you love. Because I personally work with people who are in media and communications. I work with people who are in business. I work with people who are in theology and religion departments, in psychology and sociology. I work with a lot of engineers, a lot of natural resource managers, a lot of people who think about water and urban planning. And I even work with English professors who talk about how we think about these issues, how we can talk about them. So honestly, it's really hard for me to even imagine a career that I haven't worked with. I've worked with artists and musicians. I've worked with people in the healthcare field. Definitely people who work with the land, farmers, producers, water managers, wildlife managers. So do what your passion is. Do what your heart leads you to study. And then think about how you can use the unique skills and abilities that you have that nobody else has. Each of us is as unique as a snowflake. Think about how you can use those unique abilities and passions and apply them to something important, like this issue of a changing climate and helping people.
Hi there, my name is Rachel, and I have a question for you. I am wondering how, in a world where we kind of silo ourselves, where I might be a young woman who is more liberal in their leanings, might help influence more conservative communities. So when my silo might say a lot in my social media that climate change is real and we should do things, and we are doing things, and etc. But it feels like it's difficult to influence other spheres. What are ways we can continue to depoliticize the issue and help create better conversation among whether it's political spectrums or social spectrums?
Mm-hmm. That is a great question. Thank you. That is one that I have learned myself the hard way through experience, being picked up and transplanted into West Texas. I actually live in the second most conservative city in the entire United States. The most conservative is Provo, Utah, and I spoke there at Brigham Young University last year, and I live in the second most conservative city. So there's no better way to get out of our silos or our tribes or our communities or whatever we call it. There's no better way to get out of our comfort zone than to actually talk to people who we might not agree with and listen to them. I've found that by listening to people and asking them questions and trying to understand what their fears are, what their concerns are, what their worries are, and what their loves are. And then when I feel like I kind of have a good handle on what really makes you tick, then I can figure out, and you can't do this with absolutely everybody. There's definitely been a few people where I haven't been able to do this, but 9 times out of 10, I think you really can. You can figure out some genuine point of connection, some love that you genuinely share with that other person, some concern that you genuinely agree with, some fear that has crossed your mind just as it's crossed theirs. And that genuine shared connection is the beginning of the conversation. Because once you've connected over that issue that you genuinely share, then you can share, not from the head, but from the heart, because I care about X, here's why I'm really worried about a changing climate, because it actually affects this thing that we were just talking about. And you know who says that? The U.S. military says that, if you're talking about, a security issue, or who says that? This business leader says that, or this Christian leader says that, or we can connect the issue to that shared concern. And then I also feel like talking about solutions is so important, because who is going to say, I hate that an army base in the U.S., like say if you're a U.S. taxpayer, who's going to say, I absolutely hate that they're saving us money? Who's going to say they shouldn't be saving $168 million using, wind and solar energy? Nobody's going to say that because that's a common sense solution. Everybody thinks, wow, that's great that people are cutting money so we don't have to pay it out of our taxes. So if we can find some type of solution, even a practical solution, like, hey, I love my new light bulbs because they save me money and I don't have to change them anymore. I hate getting up on those ladders and changing those light bulbs. Well, you're reducing your carbon footprint too, but hey, the light bulbs are actually great because they save you money. So as many genuine points of connection as we can find with each other, each of those points of connection is a place that we can use to build that bridge, to meet each other on, and then to continue the conversation. Because so often when someone disagrees with us, our first instinct, and even mine still after 10 years, our first instinct is immediately to focus on what we disagree on. And that never ends well. There's a picture I saw on the internet of two people arguing and one people's head exploding, and that's the picture I always think of when I'm tempted to begin a conversation with something that I disagree with the person about. If you can connect first and then transition to the issue you want to talk about, it goes a lot better. But first of all, we have to listen because we have to figure out, what is it that makes them tick? What do I genuinely share?
Here's a question from a student, Katharine. He's wondering, you've talked a lot about carbon emissions, but not about methane. Why have you not talked about methane, which absorbs heat 100 times more than CO2?
Methane actually absorbs heat 35 times more than CO2. I did my master's thesis on methane, and I did some of the studies that actually measured that number. Methane is an extremely powerful heat-trapping gas. Thankfully, we produce it in much smaller numbers than carbon dioxide, but we produce it through a lot of the same activities that produce carbon dioxide. So, for example, mining coal and extracting natural gas both produce methane because natural gas basically is methane. And so if there's any leaks in our pipelines at all of that methane just escapes. And new satellite observations have actually shown huge methane leaks, both in urban areas that have all these old pipe systems, as well as in big pipes going all the way across the country. We also produce methane from landfills, and so something that people are doing are actually literally sticking a pipe on the landfill and then burning the gas, using it to power a generator. Because when you burn the methane, you turn it into carbon dioxide, so you're reducing its efficiency by 35%, which is good. You're reducing its heat trapping ability. And then a third of the methane actually comes from the agriculture industry, much of it from the rear end of a cow. Also sheep and goats, and some of you may be thinking of your own relatives as well. My family is lactose intolerant, and I tend to think they produce a lot of methane. So what can we do about that? Well, number one is by eating lower on the food chain, we can actually reduce our carbon footprint. So the lower on the food chain we eat, the less energy is needed to produce that food. And if you're not eating ruminants, then they're not producing the methane. But they're also doing really cool things where they've discovered this seaweed that cows naturally eat if they're along the ocean, like in the Maritimes. And if you feed the cows this seaweed, it actually cuts way down on their methane emissions. And I don't know if anybody takes probiotics, but I take probiotics, and it turns out cows can take them too. If cows take probiotics, it cuts way down on their methane emissions too, because methane emissions are produced from incomplete digestion. And so the better they digest, the more effective the food that they eat. So you want cows to digest better, you want them to cut their methane emissions, and there's actually ways that you can do it. But there's so many things that we can do, and definitely eating lower on the food chain is one of those things. And my little global weirding video from this week goes through a lot of these practical steps that we can do, and that is definitely one of them.
I have a question, yeah. Hello, my name is Ed Thompson, and I guess one of the concerns I have is that you haven't talked about the benefits of carbon dioxide, and I'm talking about in terms of green production, like foliage, and we're looking at a world that's probably going to try to go to 9 billion people in the next 30 years. Mm-hmm. And carbon dioxide has an effect on production, does it not?
It does, and that's a great question. I have a great colleague, Liz Ziska at the USDA, who is specifically studying the impact of carbon dioxide on plants. And what he's found is very interesting. He has found that carbon dioxide disproportionately affects weeds and plants like ragweed that produce allergies. So in other words, ragweed, poison ivy, and a lot of common weeds flourish under higher CO2 levels. Most crop species do not. So we're looking at a world where weeds are being fed like this miracle grow from the atmosphere, and where our crops really aren't benefiting at all. And so the International Rice Institute actually has basically like a Manhattan Project to try to splice rice together with some of these weed genes to try to see if they can get rice to benefit from higher CO2 levels. But so far, they haven't been able to do that. And so far, it's not looking that great. But that's definitely something that people could take advantage of for sure. I should add too one more thing. Sorry, you reminded me of one more thing, if you don't mind, and then you can go on with what you're saying. There's also a lot of co-benefits, as they call it, from reducing fossil fuel use. And one of the biggest co-benefits is cutting air pollution. So around the world, 5.5 million people die every year from air pollution. About half of that comes from indoor cook stoves where they're burning wood. And then the other half comes from cars and smokestacks. So cutting fossil fuel use would actually cut half of those deaths. That's a lot of deaths every year, premature deaths. And then some of the programs I love are the clean cook stove programs, where they've got clean cook stoves that they're giving to people in developing countries so that they don't have to have that terrible smoke inside when they're cooking. And they don't have to go cut down trees, which actually has a negative impact as well.
I found that in greenhouses that they actually increase the CO2 to 1,000 ppm just so that they can get better production.
Mm-hmm. It works great in greenhouses where you don't have the weeds, but in the field it's a lot tougher because the weeds are going to benefit that much more. So yeah, in greenhouses, yes. But unfortunately, I don't think we can greenhouse all of the prairies.
Rob.
I'm one of the CMU students. I'd like to begin by saying it's very inspiring to see you here and doing something, well, on the screen to, do something about it to reduce your own carbon footprint, especially knowing that you're missing out on Roll Up the Rim.
Okay, will you roll up one rim for me?
I did, but the folio mugs don't even say, please try again. The one question I did want to ask was, you talk a lot about reducing your carbon emissions and just trying to cut back, but with the population growing so substantially, like if we have more people, if everyone's cutting back, where do we go from there? I just want to know if you could talk a little bit about increased population size and how that's affecting climate change.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So that's actually a question that I get a lot, but it's usually asked in a much less friendly way. It's usually asked by somebody, with their hands on their hips saying, why didn't you tell everybody that population control is the only solution? And my answer is usually, because I don't think it is. It is true that we have so many people in the world today, but the reality is that the majority of carbon emissions come from a very small proportion of us. There's this little website online where you can actually enter, where you live and what type of lifestyle you have, and it tells you how many planets we would have to have if everybody lived the same way as you. And I thought I was pretty good, and so I went to that website last year to check it out, and it turns out we'd need 4 planets if everybody lived like me. Yeah, that's pretty bad, isn't it? But the reality is that we have figured out already some really awesome ways to get our energy without producing carbon dioxide, and we're figuring out awesome ways to get our food while cutting down on the methane too. So we can still support more people if we change the way we live. And I'm not saying going back to the Stone Age at all, because that's not what I want to do either. But here's my vision. Here's my utopia. I want to live in a house that has the solar shingles that Elon Musk is making. He's making solar shingles that look just like regular shingles. You can get terracotta ones, you can get cedar shakes, you can get regular ones. And you put them on your roof and they grow your own electricity. You have a power wall in your garage that costs a few $1,000s and it saves electricity. I plug in my car every night and it charges my car. I drive along a road and the road is made out of solar panels and that road already exists. They have one in Belgium. Or you bike and you're biking along a solar bike path and they already have those in the Netherlands. And I just think that that would be an awesome world to live in where we would have enough energy for everybody. And so we could still afford to have more people. And then here's the other thing too, and this is speaking as a woman, I know that as countries become more developed, as people have access to clean water, enough food, a safe place to live, then women are able to make choices regarding how many children they want to have, because if half your children are going to die of some terrible waterborne disease before they're 5 years old, you want to have a lot of children. If your only alternative is to scrape your food from the few acres of land that you have, then you want to have a lot of children to help you. But studies have shown, and data has shown, that the more secure our lives, the less children we actually start to have, because we don't have to worry about them dying from terrible things, as they do often still today. So population, I think, will start to level off as our lifestyle improves. And our lifestyle has to improve by dealing with energy poverty, by dealing with hunger, by dealing with water shortages and water quality issues, and with dealing with issues of justice and safety and security. But the first thing we need to do is make sure that all those issues aren't exacerbated by changing climate. And that's why I really do think that tackling this issue has moved from the future to the present, and it's moved from the important into the urgent. I should warn you all that they're actually zooming the camera right in on your faces, so we are face to face when you ask me these questions.
I should have shaved. I'll be right back.
All right, me too.
My name is Bob Haverlock. I appreciate the recognition of the importance of affirmation and envisioning good possibilities as integral to gathering people to act on this issue and others. But on the other hand, I'm wondering what your sense is for a place of sadness and sorrow. Because the reality is, when people look and see what they're seeing, the byproduct is an immense sorrow or anger. Mm-hmm. And living in a culture with, an official policy of optimism, of making things great and always trying to build on the upside, it has its place, and and I think that that's helpful. On the other hand, in my own working with groups and with people on issues of environment, ecology, racism, mm-hmm. and conflict and other such matters, unless there's a place and a time that acknowledges the cost of looking at what breaks and hurts and harms, unless we can acknowledge the way in which it cracks and breaks the heart and the spirit, I think simply to build on the upside in the long term isn't good enough on its own. I think it's a dance between the two, and I think integral to building action is building in a grieving process and sorrow being acknowledged. I mean, you can't look at what we're seeing without having that going on inside you and needing a community process, a group process. So I guess my question would be, it's a long preamble, the place in your mind as you're you're obviously sensitive to enabling groups and enabling folks. The place of grief and sorrow and its relationship to joy and gladness in action, which I think is great and important, and we also need. So, what's the dance for you?
Well, I think my main answer to that is yes. Joy and sorrow are the opposite sides of the coin. Each makes each other deeper. I think as humans, that acknowledging that sense of loss is essential, because otherwise it may drive us without knowing what it is. And I have a colleague called Renee Lertzman. If you're interested, you can look her up. Renee studies specifically that. She's not a Christian, but she studies grief and loss associated with the changing climate. And I have certainly seen things that have made me cry in the things that I study. When I look at what is happening to God's creation, the first time I saw a mountain that they had cut the top off, my eyes couldn't really comprehend what I was looking at in Appalachia when I saw that. And then when I realized it was with a horrified disbelief that we could do something like that. When I see a picture of a starving polar bear, and I have seen some of them in real life, it just breaks my heart that they would be starving because of the ice melting, because of the extra blanket that we wrapped around the earth. And when I see people, which I have seen plenty of in the different countries where I have been, I'm sure many of us have too, as well as even in our own country, who are suffering from the things we mentioned, from poverty, from hunger, from a lack of a safe place to live, or from diseases that people shouldn't have, it breaks our heart, because I really believe that we have the love of God in our heart, and love can cause your heart to break sometimes, can't it? But that love is what gives us the ability to pick ourselves up and go too. So I think you're perfectly right. It's the two sides of the coin, because unless we acknowledge the impact, we lack the motive to act.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Mm-hmm. I would also actually add one more thing, which is a bit unrelated, but I was at a retreat a couple of years ago where people were talking, Christian leaders were talking about, well, how do we motivate people in this issue? And one man said, well, the main issue is that people need to repent, because every time you turn on your car, you're committing a sin. And I'm going to confess to you that when he told me that turning on my car was a sin, I thought, well, how did I get here today? How did you get here today? How do I take my child to the doctor when he's sick? How do I get to work? And I felt like, well, if that's what you're going to use to try to make everybody, change, I just feel like going out in the parking lot and getting in your car and just driving circles around you. Because that perspective of, well, there's nothing you can do because we're all terrible sinners, and you could just beat your breast and then go sin and then ask for forgiveness and go sin and ask for forgiveness again. There is the potential, I think, for this to be a spiral of guilt and despair. And while there is sorrow, again, the guilt and despair and fear is what we believe has been taken from us, so that we can sorrow, we can weep, we can repent, but then we can move forward in hope and love and fear, or hope and love and a sound mind and a spirit of power.
Asher in the back.
My name is Asher. I'm a student at CMU, and I was going through.
They just zoomed on your face, so I can read. I can read the signs behind you on the boxes.
Oh, really? It's at 4.
Yeah.
You can come over anytime. I was taking a course in stats, and there was a few terms I was thinking of. Mostly saying this is a very theoretical question. So if we were to, let's say, plot carbon content versus time graph, I'm going to assume that the carbon content has grown exponentially. Let's say in an ideal world, at a certain point in time, we've 100% got rid of the carbon emission at that point, would the graph level out, or would there be a bell-shaped curve and eventually the carbon emission would go down? Or because of the accumulation in the atmosphere already, would it be like an S-shaped curve and eventually kind of like, it'll still increase, but like gradually still be increasing?
Yes, I know what you mean. I can picture those curves. Okay, so if we reduce our carbon emissions to zero, then what's going to happen? So the carbon levels in the atmosphere are going up. If we reduce our carbon emissions to zero, they will stabilize.
Right.
They won't start going down for thousands of years because they have to have some way to take all that extra stuff out of the atmosphere. But here's the cool thing. There isn't just new technology to get energy without producing carbon. There's also new technology to try to suck this stuff out of the atmosphere. So they've figured out a way to actually chemically react air, carbon dioxide, to produce baking soda. The only problem is it would produce so much baking soda, I don't know what we would do with it. But they're trying to figure out ways to, there's chemicals that specifically react only with certain things. Like, the powder they put in babies' diapers? It's just a little bit of powder, but when the water hits it, it reacts and it binds all of those water molecules. And then the diaper weighs about 5 pounds, but it's not wet. And so in the same way, chemists are trying to figure out what chemical, if you expose it to the air, would exclusively react with CO2 and bind CO2. And they've already got a couple of options. It's a little bit too expensive right now to do it whole scale, but they're working on it. And I definitely think that some of that's going to be operational within probably 10 years or less. Oh, I should also say one of my favorite technologies is you take like a natural gas or a coal-fired power plant, and all of that carbon dioxide coming up the smokestack, you pipe it into giant bags of green algae that you hang in the parking lot. And the green algae only needs 2 things to grow. It needs water and carbon dioxide. So it eats the carbon dioxide, and you can turn the algae into biodiesel and into biojet fuel. And Norwegian Airlines is actually already running off algae fuel, and United Airlines in the States did a test run where they just took a regular airplane, didn't modify it, put the algae fuel in, and it ran 10% more efficient. So this kind of really cool stuff is coming. Like I said, it's just not quite coming fast enough.
I think we have time for, just before you ask, I think we have time for one more. I'm stuck here at the front, and I don't actually know what our curfew is tonight or anything. Is that?
I think it's just past 8:30, but we can take one more. Go ahead.
Sure.
I'm looking up that way because that's where the screen is. Maybe I should look this way.
And yes, now we're eye to eye.
Okay. Katharine, we'll be leaving here tonight, I think, tremendously inspired to be hopeful. And from your foundation of faith, I can see that things are possible that I didn't know before this evening, so thank you. I'm just wondering, when you're in the second most conservative community of the United States, and given the political climate of the US, but also in the conservative leadership here in Canada and places around Europe, I'm not asking you to be prescriptive for what you think we should do, but what place is there in your work beyond the inspirational kind of evening that today was for sort of explicit political action and those kinds of things? Oh, and before you answer the question, I wanted to tell you that this morning at 6, I was in a Tim Hortons and meeting a member of my church, and why we were there at 6 is another story, but we asked for coffee and we were going to have it in, so we got it in a mug and 2 plastic empty cups, and I was confused. And she explained that would give me an opportunity to roll up the rim. So that was an eco quandary. Would I take a mug and the empty cups just so that I could roll up the rim? I didn't. So
Good for you.
A moment of abstaining from sin.
You will be rewarded for that. That's next to crown.
Thank you. Katharine, is there a place in your mind for against the powers that want to sustain fossil fuel economies and that kind of thing? is there a place for political action? Or you talked about finding common ground with the individual who has a different opinion. That's a very personal, individual way of interacting. What is the call to be involved in a more systemic kind of way?
Great question. So I grew up in a denomination called Plymouth Brethren. I don't know if anybody knows that denomination. And they were very much of the idea that we are in the world but not of the world. And so voting was not something that you did. That was of the world. And it's really interesting because I feel like that's one of the areas where I've most changed in my life, to feel like if we're really going to be salt and light in the world, then raising our voice in the political sphere is important, because who else is going to if we don't? So people often ask, what's the single most important thing I can do? And my answer probably is surprising. This is not the answer I would have given 10 years ago. I really have become convinced that the single most important thing we can do is talk about this issue. Because studies have shown we don't talk about it, because it's kind of contentious, or we feel like it's a downer, or we're not sure what the other person thinks. So along those lines, talking about this issue to our elected officials, whether it's in our town or our city, whether it's at our province level, whether it's federal level with our MPs, talking about it is one of the most important things we can do. And even something as simple as picking up the phone, calling your MP and saying, hey, I'm concerned about this issue. I just want to let you know it's on my radar. I'm in your constituency. I'm in your riding. I want to know what you're doing about it. I've done that a couple of times with my MPs I'm in Etobicoke North. I've called them up and asked them, or sent them an email and say, hey, can you tell me what you're thinking about this? Because I'm really concerned about this. So I do think talking is one of the most important things we can do. And that's why among the different advisory boards I serve on the advisory board for Citizens Climate Lobby. They have a big program in Canada as well as in the States, and I think 70 countries around the world. And I love Citizens Climate Lobby because they're all about just bringing people in to talk to their elected officials and helping us figure out how to do that, because it's kind of scary if you've never done that before. And the first thing they teach you is research who you're talking to. And so this is kind of my answer before to, I'm sorry, I forget your name, but the girl in the back. Research who you're talking to and find out what makes them tick, and then go in and say, I really appreciate how you X, Y, and Z. And then say, and that's why I also want to share with you how important this is to me, and what I wish you would do. And you can do this again, phone call, in person, email. I've grown to think that is really important. And that coming from a Brethren girl whose entire family didn't vote for generations, I think is a pretty big statement.
John, one more question. Katharine, thank you again so much for joining us. We had some text questions that we couldn't get to, and I'm wondering if you can share with us, is there a way that we can join in the conversation over Facebook or something like that with you?
Oh, yes. So I have my little global weirding videos that come out every other Wednesday, and then the very next day, I do a Facebook live chat. So tomorrow at 7 o'clock on my Facebook page, I have a live chat, and I try to take as many questions as I can. And usually I get about 200 questions, and we get through them in about half an hour. So if you're interested, come to my Facebook page, check out the live chat. If you just want to kind of listen in, you can listen in later because it is recorded. But if you want to get your question in, then come to the live chat. They're every other week on Thursdays at 7 p.m. And if you look at our Global Weirding videos, it'll remind you, the next chat is tomorrow at this time. So absolutely. You can also find me on Twitter. You can find me on Instagram, and you can find my website, KatharineHayhoe.com.
Thanks so much, Katharine. If you were here in person, we could come and shake your hand or give you a hug or something that would seem more appropriate. It's a little bit odd to just say goodbye to someone and switch them off.
It's a little cold, but I understand.
We're also, it's literally a little cold here today too, so maybe we'll send you some frosty winds as a gesture of our thanks and enthusiasm.
Too kind.
But also, just again, thank you so much for being here this week, Katharine, and blessings to you and your work. Thank you to all of you for being here, and we have coffee and tea and cookies in the back, so we don't have to switch all of ourselves off. But Katharine, for now, I guess it's goodbye, and thank you again.